are they going to be looked at as groups to be herded around by the ruling class? And of course, the latter view doesn't have any room for gun ownership. The ruling class notion doesn't want us to be armed because, hey, it's a little harder to push people around and have guns. I think that's why gun control has been such an obsession of the liberal Democrats, of the socialists. Which
Anytime a communist regime takes over, that's the first thing they do, go after the guns. Well,
that's right.
They go after the farmers, they go after the guns, they go after the veterans. All of that is happening in this country right now. It's called, and you refer to it as, liberal media. I just watched a clip of Senator Joe McCarthy talking to CBS News and warning that this is what is happening, this is what they're doing, this is what the communists are doing. But some of Roosevelt's best friends were communists, so we made McCarthyism a bad word.
Yeah, McCarthy, as a matter of fact, as Stan Evans has pointed out in his book, and as Ann Coulter has pointed out in her book, never falsely accused by name one single communist. But what we have to keep in mind is that the left has no enemy to the left. So even people who are not communists, if they're hardcore liberal type people, what they really resent is folks like us saying that Alger Hiss, who was was he ever a stereotypical ruling class member, an Ivy Leaguer, a man of great pedigree, and he was a bloody member of the Communist Party who was a spy for the Kremlin, and when it was pointed out, people on the left went nuts. And even after the Kremlin archives became available after the fall of the Soviet Union, and it was obvious that, the bum had been on the payroll, for goodness sakes, he was doing it for money as well as hatred of the country, they still get really upset when you point out that Alger Hiss was an actual communist spy who hated the United States and identified himself as a Soviet patriot, for goodness sake. And they don't like it, even though the facts make it so clear that Joe McCarthy had that rat pegged.
Larry, they say, if you don't learn from history, you're doomed to repeat it. And I mean, we had a $2 trillion theft from the American people. Our grandchildren will never be able to pay off the interest on $2 trillion, and we gave it to the banks. We got 1 million Americans homeless, and they want to take away our guns. Isn't this? Aren't we seeing the same things happening over and over again? This is what happened in Russia that resulted in almost 60 million Russians being killed, starved to death, died through slave labor and in gulags.
And what we're seeing is the premeditated destruction of the economy of the United States by Barack Obama, who was trained all his life to be a socialist destroyer. When he was
Frank Marshall
born,
trained him as a child. My God.
Well, even before Frank Marshall Davis was in his life, his mother was a communist. She had identified with Cuba. Soviet Union was not killing enough people for her taste. So, like many on the left, she preferred Cuba as the model of the socialist experiment. And that was something that she articulated with no ifs, ands, or buts as a high school student in Mercer Island, Washington, outside of Seattle. Her husband was a Marxist who worked in the government of Kenya most of his life, his miserable life, and he was a drunk as well as a Marxist, and he drove his Mercedes-Benz. Notice that Marxists, the ones at the top live very well, even if everybody else is starving to death. And he drove his Mercedes-Benz into a tree and killed himself because he was driving while drunk. This is the lineage of Obama, a mother who almost abandoned him as much as did his father, who's gone back to Kenya ultimately. And so his grandparents raised him, his mother's parents raised him, and they were not exactly John Wayne conservatives either. They were extremely liberal and invited Frank Marshall Davis into their home, and he's the guy that became, in many ways, a surrogate father, a mentor to Barack Obama. And, you know, think about it. If you consider him as a psychologist might, this is a guy that was abandoned by his father and really paid little attention to by his mother. She didn't have any interest in raising him. He was kind of turned over to Granddad and Frank Marshall Davis. That's a pretty traumatic thing for a little boy. And no wonder the guy's dysfunctional now, because he didn't have any experience with a father who was living as a godly example of what a father should be, who God is. No wonder the guy's turned away from God. He's never seen it in his father. His father was zero, and his mother wasn't even interested in trying to jump into the breach. And so, yeah, his training was from a guy, Frank Marshall Davis, who was filled with hatred of the country. There's a book called Dupes by Paul Kenmore. He's a professor at Grove City College, and he's got photographs in there of some of the columns that Frank Marshall Davis wrote for the communist newspaper in Hawaii that just are filled with hatred of the United States, love of the Soviet Union. They can do no wrong. And by the way, Frank Marshall Davis was an actual member of the Communist Party, and Paul Kenmore found the card in the archives that he was able to access. And if you want to know the number of the Communist Party card that Frank Marshall Davis had, it's in that book, in Dupes. It's so the guy, Obama, is truly a red diaper baby. I mean, he hasn't had any training from anybody that wasn't a communist. When he went to Occidental College, it was one of the most hard-left colleges in the country. And interestingly, and nobody's explained this, apparently, according to Pamela Geller, who has a blog called Atlas Shrugged, he had a BMW as a college student. Now, here's a guy that, you know, the only money that we know of that he had was Grandma. Granddad was a bum. He didn't work. He sat at home and drank. Grandma was a bank officer, so that means, you know, she wasn't rich, but she was making a good income, but not enough to send a kid to a private college and drive around in a BMW. What are we missing? What else is going on here with this guy?
Well, you know, he was pretty. There is a name for this type of person. I mean, the movies are referred to him as the Manchurian Candidates, but he was actually pretty forthright in it. If you studied it, if you studied Soviet communist psychopolitics, they call him a change agent, and that's exactly what he promised. He came right out and told you.
Well, he did that. You're right. 5 days before the election, he said, we're 5 days away from fundamentally transforming America. When he went to Columbia, we know from a book on Obama that I'm in the process of reading right now by Stanley Kurtz, who's a researcher here in Washington, and he writes for the New Republic. It's called Radical in Chief. And this guy is a researcher of the first order. He goes to archives and he digs stuff out, and he's found that Obama attended 2 and maybe 3 annual meetings of Socialist Scholars Conference. in New York City. The first one at Columbia, where he was attending, and then the other two